Tēnā koutou katoa. Hi, I'm Tracey, the Managing Director of Aurecon and also on the Board of Infrastructure New Zealand and also the Chair of the Sustainable Development Committee of FIDIC. So I'm really delighted to be here with my fantastic panellists today. We've been told we're kind of shortening ourselves a little bit, so we have about 30 minutes together. And please, this is your time now. This is your time to get very interactive. We've been listening a lot and we've had fantastic, I suppose, introduction from Joanna, from Adrian, from Laura and from Dr. Rob Carr, which really sets the scene, which we're going to kind of hopefully talk about today. But please, you can put questions in if you feel, and for me, I haven't got my app working yet, I think there could be a roving mic, so just put up your hand if you just want to ask a question directly in that sort of way. So, and look, I'm not going to repeat what has said, but what I would like to say is that it's quite clear from what we're experiencing and what we've been hearing already today that, you know, the COVID crisis has really highlighted the need for flexibility and resilience in our infrastructure. Are factors that pretty much have often been secondary or tertiary sort of priorities before. But what is very clear, and what is clear now, is that the question is not of when, but it's more about, it's the question of when, not if, our infrastructure will be hit by climate change and other economic, environmental and social factors, which we've already, Joanna has kind of touched on and prepped us very well in terms of that. And as an industry, you know, it is time from some very big thinking around how we build flexibility into our future and to create not only sustainable but a flexible future for that. So I'm pleased to say that I have been joined by 4 big thinkers who are really going to hopefully get into the debate. We said we want to be a bit of the fun panelists and we want to kind of stimulate some good discussion today, so please get behind us and hopefully we will get. But James did say if we don't get to answer all your questions today in this session, you know, we will hang around afterwards, we're over lunch, so please come and find out if some of your questions don't get answered today. Right, rather than me introduce, I'm going to leave everyone quite quickly introduce themselves and just say why they're here today, why this is important. So I'll start with you, Anita.
Thanks. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. So I'm Anita Wreford, I'm based at Lincoln University. I also have a role in the Deep South National Science Challenge, which some of you might be familiar with, and I just wanted to flag that because we fund a range of projects, some of which are related to infrastructure. So I'd encourage you to look at our website and some of the great projects that we have funded and continue to, looking at the impacts and implications of climate change on different areas. So just a little bit of background about me. I'm sort of an economist. I look at economics and social science, thinking about how we can adapt to climate change, thinking about the long term, some of those difficult questions I hope we can talk about today. So thank you.
Kia ora, no tūranganui a rua a hau, ko Simon Drew toko ingoa. I'm the General Manager Infrastructure for Dunedin City Council. I'm a chartered professional engineer, not a roading engineer, picking up on Joanna's point about old word behaviours. I have spent 20 years in the predominantly the private sector in the construction and consultant industry and recently flipped over to local government, so I've been 2 years with local government. I'm really excited by challenges, and Dunedin has a large section of the community and of our infrastructure that's really susceptible to climate change, in particular sea level rise. So that challenge excites me. I've been involved in multi-million-dollar infrastructure projects, and dealing with climate change is by far the most complex project I've ever been involved in, and it's going to require all of New Zealand thinking, not isolated local government thinking.
Thanks, Simon. Kia ora tātou. My name is James Hughes. I work for Tonkin and Taylor. I lead the climate and resilience practice there. I've had probably a 10-year career in broadly risk and resilience and infrastructure, and have been fortunate enough to be involved in a number of the projects we've spoken about today with Anita. We've just come off the back of working on the National Climate Risk Assessment. I actually led the built environment part of that, so that was a lot of work, and Anita led the economy domain. And look, I guess just a reflection from me, and to answer Tracey's kind of question is why is this important? look, I think doing nothing is no longer an option. You know, the risks are clear. If you look at the report, the risk to the built environment, but not only that, the risk to our communities and our economy. The natural environment is really at risk. Our native species, our special places that we treasure as well, and then our kids. You know, my son, comes home and talks about climate change a lot, and he hears it at school, and there's a lot of anxiety out there. So that's why it's important, and the urgency is pretty clear as well about the speed of emissions reductions.
Yeah, kia ora. My name's Matthew Riddle. I'm the Executive Chairman of Marsh, New Zealand, also a Director. I'm here to represent the insurance industry, I think, so that'll be interesting, see how that goes. I've been in the business for over 30 years, but 20 years of that I've been involved pretty significantly with local government, so I understand there are infrastructure issues around risk transfer. I've certainly been involved in multiple losses by way of earthquake or weather events, and also involved in assisting them with, for example, recovery from government under the Civil Defence and Emergency Management Act. So I've got a bit of a stake there. A little bit of wanton self-promotion, sorry, but we are a sponsor of this. I'm holding up at the moment the Global Risk Report, the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, which is actually a joint partnership between Marsh and the Zurich Insurance Group. If you Google Marsh Global Risk Report 2020, you'll be able to find a copy, and you'll be able to find a copy of the preceding 14 risk reports, and it's a fantastic set of data about perceptions of risk by people in the game over the last few years, well, obviously 15 years. One thing that's absolutely stands out if you do look at the 2020 report and look at the risk before that is the top 5 risks in 2020 for likelihood are environmental. The top 5 risks for impact are environmental. Number 1 for impact is lack of climate change action, and number 2 is lack of climate change action for likelihood. So, the risk world is very much interested in this topic, and infrastructure as a subset, definitely.
Fantastic. I will kick off, and James, I'll put this first question to you. Climate change is just one of the many challenges that our infrastructure faces. And it's interesting, I'm just looking at Peter Reedy behind us on the screen. So, we have 3 sessions going on at the moment, and everyone's probably talking around many challenges that the industry is fundamentally faced. So how do we balance the range of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, and if you were to list all the different challenges we're facing, you probably run out of fingers pretty quickly. But from a climate change perspective, we're obviously dealing with the risks that we're facing, and those are very clear around, you could simplify it probably to too much water or too little water. Too much water being flooding, sea level rise and coastal inundation, and particularly groundwater. We've got some real issues with high groundwater levels in a number of towns in New Zealand. It's probably a largely unknown risk. And then on the too little water, the drought and the temperature impacts, we've seen the fires. But then you move into the emissions challenge and the urgency of emissions reductions and how we build better cities and how we reconcile the drive, in my opinion anyway, the drive for building more homes and sprawling our cities, which is the way New Zealand sort of tends to build at the moment, versus the need to reduce emissions. And the challenges around biodiversity and water quality as well that we're increasingly facing. So I think there's an opportunity to address all of those if we're clever about it, but I think there's a gap at the moment in having policies and actions that address those simultaneously.
Fantastic, thank you. Just Anita, following on that, because we're going to hear a lot over the next 2 days, particularly around the, we heard this morning around the deficit that exists in infrastructure. We know we're talking about the massive amount of infrastructure, the pipeline that needs to be built. But how do we on that? How do we make sure that infrastructure that we build today is still very much fit for purpose for the future?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we've already heard that alluded to a few times today, which was encouraging for me. I mean, with climate change, we have quite a lot of uncertainty, along with all the other uncertainties that we face. And so, although we have quite solid projections, but we don't know how effective the world will be at reducing emissions, so we don't know which pathway we're on. So when we think about infrastructure that we're putting in now, it's very difficult to make sure that it will still be appropriate in future climates when we don't know what those climates will be. So we really need new ways of thinking and learning around this, and I think some of our tools, someone mentioned, doing rigorous cost-benefit analysis for new infrastructure projects. And while, of course, that's important, it is really challenging when you've got this uncertainty because you've got the costs now, which you have to pay, and you can see them and they're measurable, but the benefits might not accrue until much later in the century, and you don't even know where or when or if they will accrue because of those uncertainties. So we do need really different types of tools, and luckily in some of the research that I'm involved in that Deep South is funding as well is thinking through some of these different types of approaches. So things like factoring flexibility in if we can, I guess maybe trying to buy yourself time with a range of options before you need to invest in something that's going to be really large and long-lived. And some of you might be familiar with the UK Thames Estuary 2100 project, which I think is a really great example of thinking like that. And also just for other things, thinking about not just picking one climate scenario, because we don't know if that'll be the right one. So trying to incorporate the range of futures in your design and your cost-benefit analysis, or hopefully trying to include other approaches to those decisions, I think is really important.
And maybe Simon, just building on that, because I suppose last year, James just touched on building better cities, and then the board from Infrastructure New Zealand, we went down and visited Dunedin last year, or was it the beginning of this? No, last year, where you kind of took us on a tour around, and you're faced with many challenges down there, particularly with sea level rise. You have significant amount of homes and properties along the sort of coast. But just picking up on Anita's point really around that decision making, we have a lot of uncertainty around the data and information evidence for that's required to support climate change adaptation decisions and things like that. So how do you, as DCC, how do you, ensure that the data and information, so how do you make well-informed decisions around what you're kind of building for the future, or even here and now, what you're kind of dealing with?
Yeah, thanks Tracey. Thanks for giving me another opportunity to plug the challenges that Dunedin's facing. I guess from a local government perspective, there's two elements to that. The legislative and the regulatory environment that underpin the infrastructure investment decision-making processes, complex, overlapping and evolving. So at the moment we have the RMA, which has been signalled for reform, Local Government Act, the Land Transport Management Act, the Building Act, and then alongside that sits policy statements on the coast and fresh water and urban development, and there's also Three Waters reform happening, so it creates kind of ambiguity about whose role and responsibility it is to collect data, to manage data, to understand what data is required in a really complex and uncertain world. And what I see is lots of different organisations, local governments, regional councils, central government, private infrastructure providers, the finance industry, the insurance industry, all doing slightly different things under different statutes in slightly, uncoordinated ways, and so then the data that kind of underpins all that decision is just muddied by all of the ambiguity in all of these acts.
Just following on, Matthew, I'll cut across to you now, just on that, but more, what is the role then that the insurance companies play?
Well, I think it's typically complex, but I think one of the biggest challenges the industry actually is facing is that, coming back to the comment about data sets and understanding how they actually price their capital, the inconsistency, in other words, in how some of the infrastructure is both implemented, designed. I think one of the challenges is also, is there resilience built into the life of the project from, turning the sod to actually its 50-year life expectancy? How does the industry know that it's going to be able to price that adequately and be sustainable going forward? I think one of the biggest, it's my little theme, so I'll quickly mention it, one of the biggest influences at the moment on the insurance market in this space is the regulators, and when I say that I mean in Europe. So the regulators are demanding that insurers actually have a sustainable, known, knowledgeable understanding of their risks, that they're not going to just fly by night, they're actually going to be there forever, and they're going to have a consistent view. Now, to do that, you've got to have probably a consistent view of the data. You've got to have a globally consistent view of how do you actually price and take that risk. So yeah, there's some real challenges from a global perception, And I think that's one of the challenges that's probably been referenced about, you know, the existing infrastructure and then the new stuff.
Look, I'll just turn to the app, and there's a couple of questions here. So one of the questions is, how can the industry better quantify the benefits and value of investing in resilient infrastructure, bringing that into business case? I don't know if James,
that's the $6 trillion question that I think most organisations are struggling with. Is everyone has a mandate and a desire to invest in resilience, yet you're trying to going back to Anita's comment, you can understand your costs, but quantifying those benefits where there's uncertainty, not only in the natural hazard realm, but in the climate realm, because we don't really know the direction. We know the current direction of travel around emissions, which leads to a certain warming and a certain level of sea level rise, but further out than 30 years, the scenarios diverge substantively. So it's hard to come up with, people are investing. Wellington, for example, did a big exercise in developing a resilience program business case to try and justify a significant spend in money, and that was a costly exercise. Others can reference international work that says, look, on average, there's a 10-to-1 or a 6-to-1 payback period. And my view is you can run the risk of over-analysing some of these things where we've heard today, you've got to act now and invest early, and generally the benefits are there, but hard to quantify exactly.
Anita?
Oh yeah, just a couple of extra points I'd make. I guess there are some things that we can do that will generate benefits now, so win-wins for our current situation, but also to the wider question of quantifying those other types of benefits. I think we're lucky that the Treasury is trying to include and encourage people to consider wider dimensions than just purely economic wellbeing. So considering those wider dimensions of wellbeing, social and environmental, is creeping out there a bit more. And and there are, again, in the academic world, there are increasing methods to try and capture some of those really difficult, intangible benefits. So I think we need to keep pushing that.
Here's just another question, and James, you just touched on other countries and what they're doing, but given climate change will largely be determined by the 5 to 8 largest emission countries, several of whom do not focus on climate change, including the US, even with a change of president, should we focus more on resilience and adaptation? I don't know who wants to take that or...
I don't want to dominate it, but I guess, we have to do both. So resilience is critical for New Zealand. But I saw a graphic somewhere, and I can't remember the exact figures, but all the countries that each contribute under 1% together make up about 50%. So we have to be part of that conversation and action as well.
Maybe, Simon, this might be one for you. It's New Zealand, small but perfectly formed, an island nation, useful attributes in responding to a pandemic, but limiting our climate response impact. How do we resolve our reliance on other nations matching our efforts?
Yeah, well, I guess we've got that number 8 why mentality, haven't we? And I mean, back to my previous point, it's an all in New Zealand approach, and what I saw during COVID was we all rallied behind the same cause, and the leaders of infrastructure at this conference have the ability to raise that mandate, and I noted that Joanna used the thing disrupt old world behaviours, and Rod talked about behaviour change leadership, and I think we need to embed some of this thinking into our decision making frameworks, and be leaders and really drive this forward.
Matthew, Joanna talked about obviously sustainable finance and lots of the models and the green bonds and green investment that kind of sits behind it. But from the perspective of global insurers and reinsurers, what are some of the drivers which will influence your ability to be able to provide sustainable assistance?
Well, I think, as I say, front of mind at the moment is the regulators. I think they're very focused on that as both businesses themselves, in other words, the responsibilities, the governance of the directors, and also obviously the controls that the regulators put on their activity in the market. I know some of their concerns are about maintaining insurability. They do not, from a reputational point of view, want to actually flee the market, as it were, and that's on a global basis. One of the challenges we have in, I guess, my space is that New Zealand is very much attached to the world. We don't have the economy to sustain this ourselves. We do rely on the reinsurance market, who then support the insurance market, who then support us. So I think they are worried about that, and they are worried about, I think, the attribution of science. In other words, what is the consistency of their understanding of our risks? And we are, risks will change. I am no expert, someone can answer this one, but the risks will change in various parts of the world. New Zealand's risks will change as sea level rises. Different parts of the world will have different issues, and that will start to dominate the thinking, of course, of the capital markets, the insurers as well. So we are a little bit stuck with the rest of the world and how they go forward.
Can I just add to that? I mean, there's been some really interesting conversations around insurance, in context of climate change lately, particularly, and there's some research that's just coming out through the Deep South, but it's around the point at which insurance companies will actually partially or fully retreat based on a return period on an event. And if you look at some of the stats, if New Zealand, on average across New Zealand, 30 to 45 centimetre rise in sea levels will shift a 1 in 100 year coastal flood event to an annual event. So think about that. An event that happens 1 in 100 years will happen every year with a modest sea level rise of around less than half a metre, and that will occur in roughly mid-century according to current predictions. So that raises a whole bunch of concerns. Insurance will be gone, out. Feels that, insurance is there to cover uncertain things, but and then it raises a whole bunch of questions, as you all know, around who pays and who covers those sorts of
And if I just comment very briefly, there is a liability aspect to this as well. So Simon, unfortunately, will be in the here and now on that. In other words, if I'm an owner of infrastructure and it causes damage by either nuisance or negligence to the third party, that will be an issue going forward as well, because that infrastructure will be put under more and more stress as it transitions into whatever it transitions to.
Just on, I suppose, there is a lot of, we know New Zealand, there's a lot of ageing assets and ageing infrastructure and things, and locking in long-lived assets can trap us into very much old ways of doing things and old way of thinking. We've heard that this morning from PM, we don't want to go back sort of thing, and one risk is the creation of stranded assets that have really, really low economic value at the end of the day. Do you think that as an industry, an infrastructure industry, that we've been really slow to adapt to new technology and new ways of doing things, particularly digital technology?
Yeah, I do. The local government, central government are quite risk adverse because of the frameworks that underpin them. So, and as the large infrastructure owners, we have been slow to adopt to that technology. I think that's starting to change, and I guess I go back to leadership again. It's driving that change, understanding the data that we need. I see lots of solutions trying to find a problem, and it's really important that that we identify the problem and the data required to underpin that. Technology is quite a buzz thing at the moment, but often in my role I get sort of sales pitches for this technology and the latest, greatest whiz-bang bounce toy, but it's really important that we go back to what is the problem we are trying to solve, not here's a piece of technology that could solve a problem.
Yeah, I agree, and on a slightly different tack, I think there's also an issue with, what was this expression, the gravity of business as usual. We really, and this is more in a political realm, where we kind of have the ability, and there's a bunch of solutions out there that, let's take in the transport space, trying new things that might not necessarily cost a lot of money, but we could implement tomorrow. And an example is, NTTA's got a really cool program out there called Innovating Streets. So it's out there to encourage and fund councils to do innovative, low carbon, for example, active modes of transport. But getting those moving and getting the political buy-in to try something different is really hard, and that's a leadership question.
I'll just pick up on that. Dunedin City was the first to do an innovating street, and it was absolutely hated by the community because it was a change, and it was probably done in the wrong community, but the feedback to council was overwhelmingly negative.
Well, Tauranga is next in line, so everyone keep an eye on Tauranga City. They're trying something now, so we'll see if it keeps over the line.
Hopefully, some lessons learned there. Just another question from the floor. What would panellists be looking for in a reformed RMA to assist the climate change response? And maybe I'll add to that because, we saw Laura in the session kind of when she kind of gave her what the UK was doing. And, recently the European Commission has proposed 55% carbon reduction target by 2030 as part of its EU Green Deal to eliminate climate change by 2050. And as such, we are seeing many policies go hand in hand in delivering co-benefits for each other. So how well, I know there is a session, I think, either later today or tomorrow on the reformed RMA, but how well is New Zealand doing in delivering co-benefits through our policies to tackle these sort of issues? I don't know,
well, just one aspect that I know is a really important issue is that of liability to councils. So again, some of the work that's been done in Deep South is looking at basically councils are being sued if they don't facilitate adaptation or require adaptation, and then they're being sued if they do. So at the moment they're in a really tricky position. So I think that's a key area from my perspective.
Anyone else want to?
I guess just creating some consistency to common problems, and I know the Ramsden report talked about if there is a managed retreat aspect to any solutions, that there is a framework for doing that in a consistent approach across New Zealand. Because I guess what I see at the moment is different councils doing different things and having to start from scratch for common problems.
Yeah, look, I think there's so much that's going to be included in that RMA reform, and there's so many opportunities around co-benefits. There's stuff around, for me, probably the key thing is the forget the name, the urban. What's the other part of it? The managed retreat and the urban centres one. So how do we build better cities, and how do we actually, I guess, create the right incentives to get well-designed, compact cities that create economic value, and because in many of our small towns we've got the opposite occurring, but it brings a whole bunch of other unwanted negative co-benefits through decline and economic decline, etc.
Matthew, there's another question here, maybe you could help respond to this. Is there any real alternative to carbon taxation to ensure emissions targets are met? Sorry, I threw that one at you.
Thanks for that. Yeah, there probably are, and as you can imagine, particularly in my world, there's an awful lot of different vehicles which are explored. So I think that's when we talk about also the regulator's involvement. In other words, what type of financial vehicles are going to produce, how the capital market's going to approach. There is already solutions out there in relation to protecting investment in carbon credits, etc. So look, I think the answer is yes, but it comes back to the same problems. It's about the data, understanding how to actually effectively price that as a financial vehicle.
And just on the funding side, there is sorry, Anita,
I was just going to add the Swiss cheese analogy that we had earlier about, it requires a range of measures, really, and carbon pricing is one of them.
Just on picking up on the funding, there is a question specifically for you, Simon. How is DCC thinking about their funding of their climate issues in Dunedin South? Is there someone here from Dunedin South? Clearly.
Which particular street?
That's the billion-dollar question. So my council have acknowledged there is a challenge and have a $35 million budget to invest in South Dunedin, which is one of the most susceptible communities to sea level rise. I think it's sometimes not about new financing, it's about spending the money we already have in new and effective ways and changing the focus from old world behaviour. I guess one example I'm dealing with at the moment is we're taking recycled aggregate from, you mill the road, you've got recycled aggregate, you smash down your building, you've got recycled concrete. So we're trying to create an aggregate that you can take from recycled things and then use that back in the road, so creating the circular economy. But we're caught up in the engineering profession anyway, caught up in NZTA M4 specifications and this kind of stuff. And solving these issues requires new ways of thinking, and we have to move away from some of this, taking rock from a quarry, crushing it, putting it in the road, and then digging it up, chucking it out. So it'll require some different kind of thinking and being flexible with the way we manage our infrastructure.
Fantastic. I'm conscious of time. I'm fearful of Leonard told me keep an eye on the clock, and now it's starting to flash frantically at me. Joanna, there's a question for you, and I'm going to read it out, and whoever has posted it can come and find you. It says, how do we assess investments where the outcomes is more than just commercial revenue? What is the green revenue? So whoever maybe asked that question could come find Joanna on that. But just to kind of conclude a little bit, and it's interesting what our Prime Minister said this morning, as we rebuild our economies post-COVID, we do have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to embed decarbonisation and long-term productivity into our thinking. And not only do we want to emerge from this having to kind of, and I think you touched on it there, Simon, that we want to emerge having bounced forward, really leveraging the disruption to be strong, more resilient than before. And as we're hearing of the next 2 days, we have the opportunity to really set our vision and kind of see what does that really look like for us in New Zealand. And interesting, yesterday I got a post from the Climate Change Commission on social media, and I kind of opened it up, and it said, everyone has a stake in how our country responds to climate change, to help New Zealand transition to climate resilience and low emissions future. And I think that's what we've been hearing quite a lot in this room and at this, that everyone has a big role to play collectively together. And I think that's what we've seen as an industry, to deal with COVID, and what we've done as an industry, we have came highly collaborative together to tackle what we're kind of faced with. And I truly believe we can kind of do this together. And actually my daughter this morning, when I told her that I was coming for this session, she recently had, she's 8, and as they have to do their little sort of speeches. And she actually did it on the future. We heard from our emerging talent this morning, but it's all about how kids need to be determined the future, and it's their job to ultimately look after the world. And she had a Dr. Seuss quote in it, and this is the Dr. Seuss quote she told me about, is that unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better, it's not. So I do hope it will get better, and thank you, and I'll hand back over to Andrew. Thank you.